you might be able to figure out. So I'm going to be talking about using multiple databases with Merb. This is leaning on some functionality that DataMapper provides for us. And in particular, the example that I'm going to show is kind of like a simple, kind of like toy app that I've been playing with that actually demonstrates doing this. So you can have an idea of maybe why you might do it and kind of how some of those pieces fit together, because some of them are non-obvious at times, as you may not be too surprised by. So the first thing is, as you all know, within your config, the database.yaml has how you connect to your different databases, and what you may not immediately realize is that it's just a hash. And so DataMapper actually lets you define multiple keys within the hash, and then each one will get mapped to different databases that you can then access. So the last point of this is kind of important. The way that I've been doing it out of, to some extent, laziness, basically, is that I've been assigning whatever primary database I want to use, which is to say, like, unless I tell you otherwise, please use this database. I just assign to the default key, which is what it actually does if you aren't defining multiple repositories at all. Like, if you just have a normal database.yaml file, you're making a default repository. So the other suggestion that I've gotten from several people that I've talked to about it is that you might not actually want to do that. You might want to use distinct, meaningful keys that aren't default for everything, because then if you forget to specify something, it will say, I don't know what the hell to do with this, which is maybe a better idea than actually ending up putting something in a repository that you're not realizing that it's going into. And just as a quick note, DataMapper calls them repositories, they're databases. If I go back and forth on terminology, I'm sorry, but hopefully that's clear moving forward. So then in terms of actually using it, there are a couple different ways. The first one is if you run the repository command with a key as a symbol, you can pass a block, and whatever's inside of the block gets run within the context of the repository that you're calling it with. So that can be really useful in like one-off cases if for some reason you want to do one particular command within a database. I haven't found that I need to do that very often. Usually it's a more wholesale thing for me of like, this particular model I want to hang out in this database, and this model I want in this database, in which case like you don't want to have to wrap every single like thing.all call inside of one of these context blocks, because it's just a mess. Like it would be really hard to maintain and keep up. You'd forget to do it. You'd have a lot of problems. The other option is then, again, in the case of individual queries, you can pass in the same kind of thing as a key on a query, and thank you. Then that particular query will happen within the context of that particular database. And then, so then the last part is what I was talking about before, is that it's a case that I've run into a lot anyways. There's some particular model that I want to store in a particular database. Well, within DataMapper, generally when you include the resource module, which adds all the persistence functionality, it defines this default repository name thing, which normally contains the symbol default. So if you redefine it with some other key there, then by default that model will load from and save to whatever key you specify. So you're probably wondering, like, why does this really matter? Why would I want to do this? You know, what is the big deal? So the big thing is that, as a few people have said before, relational databases, what we use now in most cases, aren't necessarily the best fit for everything. It's not clear that they will be the thing that we're going to continue using indefinitely. Like, there's a lot of times where, you know, you find yourself trying to force something into a data store that maybe isn't the best fit. So it's helpful to have the ability to say, I want 95% of my functionality to all fit within this context, but this other 5%, boy, it would be so nice if I could do it this other way. It's just so much simpler. And so that's the use case that I've been running into. And so in my case, I've been using Couch alongside MySQL. So there's kind of different benefits and problems with each of them. This is kind of like a quick overview of some of the things that I've run into. MySQL, as you know, is schema-based. Like you have to define the tables up front, which can be a pain if you have objects where from one object to another there might be a lot of differences in what fields there might be. You could end up with either like really wide sparse tables or potentially lots and lots of separate different tables, and it can get to be a real mess. And part of that may just be in terms of like you could do better data modeling up front to not run into that, but it's not always that easy. So it can be really nice to do that, but you're probably not, at least, I don't know, there's a lot of different paradigms in terms of joins versus doing some of the complex lookups that you can do in Couch. So there are some cases where I think SQL is probably going to be better there still, and obviously SQL is very good for doing table-based stuff. So if it's table-based, it's clear like that it's a good fit there, you don't have any issues with it, just leave it there by all means. Another big thing for me is that Couch's security model is basically not really there yet. They've been working on it, but it's not like really fully implemented. So if you have stuff that you want to make sure secure, that you can potentially lock down different areas for different people, that kind of thing, like you should probably keep it in something that is more established in that regard. One nice thing, at least in my experience so far working with Couch also, is that it doesn't have some of the issues with like blobs and text fields that SQL does. Like SQL is kind of slow loading up text stuff. Couch doesn't really care what kind of fields you're talking about. It basically stores everything as JSON, so it kind of all plays nice. And I've also been using it for more like binary data, images, videos, stuff like that, using their attachment stuff. And I've had some pretty good luck with that. I don't know how scalable it is or anything. That's kind of an open question. But anyway, there's trade-offs. So CouchDB itself, which some of you may not know that much about, it's a RESTful based database. You run it and it basically provides an HTTP interface that you interact with RESTfully. You do queries using JavaScript. So you can write full map and reduce queries to do. It stores them in what they call views, and so that's how you do more complex lookup stuff. And then all of the data is actually persisted as JSON, so that can make it really easy to use if you're doing web services, AJAX type stuff, because you can actually get back a data directly from the server, or directly from the database that you can do things with. And it supports file attachments, which, as I said, I'm using for images and music and stuff. And so now I was going to talk a little bit about my like sort of toy app that I threw together to kind of demonstrate how you might do this, why you might do this. And I think it does some pretty cool stuff. I don't know that I would deploy it anywhere, at least not right now, but you know, it's on its way. It's pretty new. So one of the big things that I was talking about in terms of like big nasty tables is within DataMapper, if you're doing single table inheritance, it basically takes all of the fields that the parent has and then all of the fields of each of the children and throws them together in one table and has a special field in it called a discriminator that ends up deciding which class it actually should be loaded as. So you can end up with like a really big nasty table without trying too hard. But if you're working within Couch, you don't really need to do that. You can just persist whichever fields are relevant to the particular model onto that one record. So it keeps everything a lot cleaner. You don't end up with like a huge table. So in my case, I decided that, you know, this sounds like a good thing to make a tumble log in. Tumble logs, you know, you end up with, you might have 10 or 15 different kinds of posts you could make, and each kind of post can have completely different fields. You know, you might have a post that has an MP3 in it, a post that has a video in it. You might have an image, you might have a quote or a chat. Like there's a lot of different cases. And granted, this is like pretty simple because like even if you took all of the fields from all of those things I just mentioned, you're still maybe only talking about a table that would have 10 or 15 columns or something. Like, but I think it still provides a good like obvious example of like, here's a simple thing, you know, this is why the things fit together. And so I put this together, and here's a quick example. You can see here's 3 different kinds of posts. The first one is a code post. So it has some different fields than other things do, and then it actually gets rendered differently. And then there's a review post, and so the review needs to have like what rating you gave it, which is different from the code. And then there's just a quote. And then here is where, one of the ways anyway, where I think it gets interesting. This is an image that is displaying, but if you look at the URL, you can maybe tell anyway, it's going to actually port 5984, which is the couch port. So as opposed to actually having that image on the file system or something else, I'm actually literally persisting the image into couch as an attachment on that record and just asking couch, hey, can you give me that image that I put on that record a little bit ago? And I don't know if this is like really going to be good performance-wise. I haven't tried it at a large scale or with like huge files or anything, but it's been so convenient in terms of like putting stuff together. I don't have to worry about messing with the file system at all or using, you know, the attachment plugins or anything else. I just say, hey, I have some data I want to put on this record, and I have a file. Let's just put that with the record too. And so I went ahead and added video and MP3s the same way. Your mileage may vary on that. I think it's been patched in Couch, but the currently released version of Couch, there's a limitation where you can only do uploads up to 1 meg. So if you try to do anything over a meg, it'll just drop your connection. But you can patch it pretty easily, so if you have any questions about that, you can ask me. So in terms of that, a few of the details, the specifics. I do have a simple login authentication system. I will switch it almost certainly to use Merb auth, but I just, you know, I was rushing to get things done for the conference. It hasn't happened yet. But one of the big things is, as you saw, I'm serving stuff directly from Couch. So I've just been doing this on localhost. If you were actually like deploying this somewhere, you know, that could get kind of messy, hard to say how you'd want to firewall it and that kind of thing. But at the very least, you don't want to put your user data in that same database because you don't want somebody to go to, you know, :5984/user/something and see a user record. I mean, I'm salting and everything my password, so you're not going to get that in plain text, but still, like, that's not a good idea. So I'm actually persisting that into MySQL to keep it safe, and because, you know, user data is a good fit for MySQL anyway. The files are saving and loading from Couch, as I showed you. And as I said, it's mostly a proof of concept, and as I've said about 8 times, because this is the main question I get, I'm not trying to like ram it down your throats or anything. In terms of load and performance, I really don't know. It's an interesting idea. I've been working on some similar integration between 2 databases for work. And so this was kind of a toy side project to push the limits a little bit more. The attachment stuff I hadn't messed with before working on this project, a few other things. So I can't speak to how this would do if you had, you know, a few thousand users that had their own tumble logs that were all trying to update them or something. Like, I don't know about that. And one of the things that I just ran into earlier this week that I was getting really weird errors where sometimes it seemed like the relationship fields that are generated were there and sometimes not. So what I'm talking about is like if a user owns something, you would expect that there would be a user ID. Sometimes it would find the user ID, sometimes it wouldn't. It was like a big mess. And how I had been doing it was I was using these repository key do block statements to wrap the belongs to and has many things into the proper database context. So within the model, I would say, all right, this belongs to a model, but I don't want you to use the default repository name that I defined earlier because that record is somewhere else. So in my experience, it actually seems to work better if you use the repository key wrapping for belongs to, but when you're defining has n or has one or has whatever, to actually use the repository as a key into the has. And my way to remember it, at least, I haven't dug into the DM internals enough to tell you for sure, is basically like the first statement is effectively you defining a property on the model. You're saying this thing should have a model ID property, and so you want to make sure that the definition of that property is defining a property that should be persisted in that repository, whereas the has-n is basically just defining a query. It's saying, you know, if you call this .models function, I want that to actually call this query that has, you know, some particular properties, one of which is that it's in this other repository. So that's just something to watch out for. If you do it the other way, you might get weird errors. And so I have this up on my GitHub account. There's the URL. I'd love to hear other people's experiences with it. I think to some extent this might just be a toy. I don't know how it will scale. I'd love to hear what people have to say about it. and to have other people banging on it and seeing what those kinds of issues are. And so I would love to field any questions you have. I know Couch is kind of this weird thing that a lot of people would like to play with but haven't had a chance yet, and so I hope maybe this is a good way to kind of introduce you to it a little bit and provide an entryway to it. And again, the URL, I would love to have all the feedback that you have, so.
Do you have to use DataMapper to use CouchDB with Merb?
I am not surprised by that question, considering that we had this discussion before. There are a lot of other sort of competing libraries in terms of what the best way to interact with Couch is, and heated debate and argument that go along with it. So the thing is, DataMapper makes a lot of assumptions about what kind of database you have and how you're using it. And maybe to that extent, like there are maybe issues with DataMapper in terms of it shouldn't be making those assumptions. But kind of as it stands now, you kind of get forced into some weird mismatch paradigms if you're using DataMapper with Couch. And so there are other things like it's Couch REST, right? There's another framework called Couch REST that Madadi, which is his username, not his real name, but and JChris both on GitHub work on. It's under JChris's directory, so it's Couch REST, which is another. It's kind of a more standalone, doesn't have anything to do with DataMapper per se, and attempts to more closely map the Couch paradigm in Ruby. I haven't personally worked with it, but there's a lot of different ways to interact with it. I felt like since I was doing a lot of specifically DataMapper things that the tight integration of having the kind of DataMapper expectations throughout were worth it, even though maybe I'm making some trade-offs in terms of like the tightness of the paradigm. So yeah, there are different ways to interact with Couch, and some of them may be better for your usage. I hope that means I explained it really well.